Hi everyone, welcome back to PolyCloud YouTube channel, your go-to channel for mastering Microsoft Azure and clearing the AZ-104 Azure Administration certification. In this session, we are diving into a very important concept, Azure Policy and Compliance Management. If you have ever wondered how organization maintains, control and enforce the standard across the Azure environment, then this video is going to clear it all up. So here are what you will learn in this video, that what Azure policy is and how it helps to govern and compliance, how to assign policy using Azure portal, CLI and PowerShell, how to create and assign your own custom policy, how to manage those policy, and finally how the policy ensure your resource stay compliant automatically. If you're preparing for AZ-104 exam or wanted to strengthen your real world Azure governance skills, this video will help you. Make sure you like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you will never miss an part of this Azure service. So let's get started.
As an Azure administrator, you need to have the skills that will allow you to manage Azure resource configuration and compliance with security standards. Azure Policy allows you to create and monitor those compliance policies with powerful dashboard capabilities. In this course, I will begin by outlining how Azure Policy can be used for deployment, configuration, and security compliance. Next, I will assign built-in Azure policies to the Azure hierarchy using the portal, the CLI, and PowerShell. And then I will create and assign a custom policy based on custom requirements. And then I will group related policies together in a policy initiative. This course can be used to prepare for exam AZ-104, Microsoft Azure Administrator. Azure Policy is a very important part of overall governance of your Azure environment. Azure Policy allows us to control how resources get deployed and how they are configured over time so that they might become compliant with some kind of standard configuration baseline or security baseline that we want to enforce in the organization. As an example, imagine that we want to ensure that all virtual machine disks are encrypted. Well, we can use Azure Policy so that it will scour all virtual machines in our subscription, and we can view compliance reports to see which virtual machines have their disks encrypted and which do not. That's only but one possible example of thousands of different policy configurations. So policy in Azure is not just for compliance, but it certainly is used for that. You have a number of built-in policies, but you can also create your own custom policy if you have specific configuration items that you want to check. So Azure Policy then is not the same thing as role-based access control, RBAC. It's more granular. The purpose of RBAC is to assign permissions to Azure resources, maybe to let Azure technicians have the ability to create and manage storage accounts perhaps in only a resource group and not the entire subscription, or maybe only allow admins to start and restart virtual machines but not manage them in any other way. But Azure Policy gets much more detailed because what we can do, for instance, is control types of resources that can be deployed. We can also control where those resources can or cannot be deployed. As an example, with Azure RBAC, you can determine who can deploy virtual machines or not, but that's it. If you want to determine that there are only certain sizes for virtual machines that are allowed to be used, or that you only want virtual machines deployed into certain regions, that's where Azure Policy comes in. So far, we've got compliance and resource control when those resources are deployed. You can even configure Azure Policy to add tag value defaults if they're not filled in when technicians deploy new resources. Technically, Azure policies are JSON formatted text files, and some policies accept parameter values that you specify when you assign them. And when you assign a policy, you are assigning it to a part of the Azure hierarchy, whether it's a management group, a subscription, or a resource group. And remember that a management group is used in larger enterprises that have multiple subscriptions, where they can organize those subscriptions into different management groups. Of course, if you assign an Azure policy to the management group, it will flow down and apply to all subscriptions, If you apply an Azure policy to a subscription, it'll flow down to all of the resource groups in that subscription and ultimately all of the resources. You could assign an Azure policy to a specific resource group if you need that type of granular control. And if you assign a policy to a subscription, you can actually exclude some specific resource groups from having that Azure policy applied. We then have the notion of Azure policy effects, and this is defined within the policy definition. The first policy effect is append. So when a resource is being deployed, or if it's being updated, you can use append to append field values. So for instance, for a storage account, you might want to add a range of IPs from which that storage account can be accessed. We then have the audit policy effect, which means whatever it is that's being checked, maybe virtual machine disk encryption, it'll create a warning event. So it gets logged, but it's not going to stop anything from happening. Audit if not exists. So for a given resource, let's say a virtual machine that matches a condition in the policy, for instance, if it doesn't have virtual machine disk encryption enabled, you can take a look at related resources such as a public IP address to see if their configuration meets a certain criteria. We then have deploy if not exists. So if a specified condition is met, then a template can be used to deploy resources. This can also include remediation, such as changing a configuration for devices that aren't compliant with some kind of setting. Then we have the deny policy effect, which, as it states, denies something from happening. So if we're only allowing within a policy the deployment of virtual machines in the East US and West US regions, and a technician tries to deploy something in Canada Central, then it will be denied and it will not be allowed to happen. But that technician, of course, assuming they have permissions to deploy virtual machines in the first place, would be able to deploy the VMs in the allowed regions. Then we have the notion of Azure Policy Initiatives. Policy initiative is simply a group. It's a group of related policies. So instead of assigning individual policies, let's say to a resource group, maybe there are 5 different policies that do different things, but you want them all applied to a resource group. Instead of 5 separate assignments, you could have a single assignment if you create a policy initiative with those policies in it. So for example, we might have a policy initiative where we want to harden regional Azure resources. Now that could mean a lot of things. So maybe there is a policy in that initiative that will check that VM disk encryption is enabled and that will check that endpoint protection is enabled. When you want to manage Azure Policy, you can do it using the Azure portal, so using the GUI, but you can also manage Azure Policy assignments at the command line using the Azure CLI, as well as using Azure PowerShell. In this demonstration, I'm going to use the portal to assign Azure Policy. Azure Policy, as we know, uses policy definitions that can do things such as checking for compliance. We might have a baseline of configurations that are acceptable in the organization, whether it's for virtual machines or SQL database deployments or whatever. And we can check that deployments adhere to our configuration standards, so baselines. So Azure Policy can be used for compliance. It can also be used for things like restrictions, perhaps to restrict where virtual machines can be deployed or to add default tag values when new resources are deployed. So its uses are many. Let's take a look at how to work with this. Here in the portal, the first thing I'll do in the search bar at the top is I'll search for the word policy. That's going to take us into the Azure Policy Management part of the Azure environment. In the left-hand navigator, we can go to definitions. From here, we can view both policy definitions as well as initiatives. So under the definition column, it tells us whether we're viewing an initiative or whether we're looking at policy. So we can filter for policies or initiatives. Of course, a policy is a specific definition for checking or restricting something or controlling configuration in some way in Azure. For example, here we've got a custom policy called Limit VM Size to Standard A1. If I click to open that up, we can view the JSON for that policy definition. So here we've got a not section in the policy definition that says if our virtual machine SKU name is not standard underscore A1, then the policy effect, remember we talked about policy effects? In this case, it's denied. In other words, we're only allowing the deployment of virtual machines using the standard underscore A1 size. Now, depending on where this policy is assigned in the hierarchy, such as a subscription, a resource group, an individual, such as a management group, a subscription, a resource group, that's where it will determine that this will be in effect. But very powerful. But that's custom. We have a number of built-in policies as well. We can scroll through them. We can also filter. So if I search for the word disk, for example, then we have policy definitions related to the word disk. For example, configure managed disks. Those are the virtual disks used by virtual machines to disable public network access. Or OS and data disks should be encrypted with a customer managed key. Remember that a policy is an individual item that can be applied to a part of the Azure hierarchy, but a policy initiative is simply a collection or a grouping of related policies. We can go to the assignments view to view any current assignments. For example, we have an individual policy for checking for system updates that are missing on VMs that's been applied to the scope called pay-as-you-go. That's my subscription. So it's going to check all the VMs in a subscription to see if they're missing system updates. Next, we have a policy initiative for PCI DSS v4 compliance. That's for sensitive cardholder information. That's also been applied to our pay-as-you-go subscription. If I were to go to the compliance view, any existing policy and initiative assignments will yield results here. For example, for PCI DSS, the overall compliance is non-compliant. Let's take a look at that. So it looks like we've got one compliant resource in our subscription that adheres to PCI DSS security controls, but 65 resources are considered non-compliant. That's not good. So we can get the details on that down below. So strong authentication for users and administrators is established and managed. That's a standard PCI DSS security directive. If we click on that, we can go to the Resource Compliance tab down below to view the offenders. So we can see which resources in the subscription are compliant. So we've got a couple of virtual machines here running Ubuntu Linux, Windows Server, but we've got one Windows Server here that is non-compliant. So we can click on it to drill down and see, well, it's not compliant with auditing diagnostic settings, minimum password auditing. So this is how we can determine where problems might lie. So this is very powerful because this is being checked all the time in the background. As we add new resources, this compliance view will automatically become up to date. So actually creating the policy assignment or the initiative assignment can be done under the assignments view, where you can choose assign policy or assign initiative. I'll choose assign policy. The first thing I'm going to do is go down and select the policy definition. So I'll search for OS and data because I want the policy for OS and data disks should be encrypted with the customer managed key. I would add it. The question is, where do you want that applied? Up at the top, that's where the scope selector box is. We could select a management group. We know that could be a collection of subscriptions. So it would check all of the VMs in all of those subscriptions, or it could be an individual subscription within which you could also specify an individual resource group where this should be checked. Maybe you don't want to check the entire subscription. So you would make your selection. You can also add exclusions. So if you've applied it to an entire subscription, maybe you want to exclude a testing resource group from checking for that stuff. You would then simply click Review and Create, and you've now got a new assignment for OS and data disks encrypted with customer managed keys. If you go to Compliance, it'll show up there, although it won't be up to date yet. So you might have to come back here and refresh to eventually see that resultant policy output. In this demonstration, I'm going to be using the CLI to assign Azure Policy. We've seen how we can use Azure Policy to check for compliance, such as ensuring that we are compliant with PCI DSS for sensitive cardholder data if our business deals with that type of data. So we might get a list of virtual machines or VNet configurations that do not comply with required security standards, And so we can focus our attention on them to bring ourselves into compliance. But you can also use Azure Policy, as we've seen, to restrict things, such as allowing the deployment of virtual machines only into a particular region. So where we've done that with the portal, we're now going to do it in the CLI. So I've launched Cloud Shell here in the portal. The first thing I want to do is run AZ Policy Definition list-o for output table. I want an output table format. This will take a moment to run as there are many policy definitions. And this list will contain both built-in and custom policies. Okay, so as we imagined, there are plenty of policies returned here with a description. Of course, all we really want is the name. So I'm going to use the up arrow key to bring up that previous command. And I'm just going to get rid of the output table part of that syntax. After definition list, I'll use -- query space, open close square bracket, dot, display name, where name is spelled with a capital N. I know this is the correct attribute name. That's better. Now the list is easier to look at in terms of the policy names. Notice we've got some policies like allowed resource deployment regions and configure diagnostic settings for SQL databases to log analytics workspace. There are so many things you can do here. It's worth taking a bit of time to familiarize yourself, if you haven't already, with the policies, the built-in policies that are already there and ready to be assigned to the hierarchy. That being said, what I'm going to do is search for a particular policy. Now, I know how to get a list of policy names, so that's how I can figure this out. So what I'm doing is running AZ policy definition list -- query, and then in double quotes and open and close square brackets, I have question mark, display name equals, and then in single quotes in here, I'm looking for allowed virtual machine size SKUs. So the whole thing, that expression is within open and close in square brackets and open and close in double quotes. Enter. Okay, so it returns the details related to that specific policy. So what I'm interested in here is the name property, not to be confused. With display name. This is more of an ID for the policy, which I will select and copy, because the next thing I want to do is create a variable. Let's call it policy, and it will equal that policy ID. I'll press enter. So if I echo $policy, it returns back that value. The next thing I want to do is determine the scope for the poly assignment I will ultimately create. For that, I'm going to store the details in a variable called scope. Scope equals $, because I'm going to execute another statement, an expression here, and I want the return result to be stored in this variable. So $, open parentheses, AZ group show -- name HQ, so the resource group, -- output TSV, tab separated values, -- query ID. I want the ID of the HQ resource group to be stored in the scope variable so I can assign it later. Let's press enter. Let's that go back. $ scope. Okay, looks good. That's the resource ID for the headquarters resource group. Now what I'm doing with this longer expression is I'm creating a variable called policy param. You can have parameters for policies, because ultimately what I want to do is I want to control virtual machine sizes that are allowed to be used. So I've got my variable policy param equals I have an open single quote, open curly brace, open double quote, list of allowed SKUs, close double quote, colon. Then another curly brace. In quotes, I have value colon, and then I have a collection of values for allowed SKUs or sizes. They're within square brackets. Each one is within double quotes, separated by commas. So standard D2SV3, standard D4SV3, whatever it is I want to allow. And then I close it all out with a closing, square bracket, and curly braces, and a single quote. Let's press enter, and let's echo back the $ policy param variable. Okay, so now that that's done, let's think about what we've done. We've got a reference to a policy ID. We've got a reference to the resource ID where we want it applied for the HQ resource group. And we've got the specific details for limiting which virtual machine sizes or SKUs can be used. So the last order of business would be to actually create the policy assignment. We haven't done that yet. So let's clear the screen and let's do this. We're going to use the following syntax: AZ Policy Assignment Create -- name. What do you want to call the assignment? This is what you would see when you retrieve policy assignments at the command line or in the portal. I want it to be called allowed virtual machine SKUs -- display - name. Same thing. -- scope. Where should this apply in the Azure hierarchy? Well, remember, we've got a variable called $scope with the resource ID of the HQ resource group. -- policy. We have the policy definition stored in a variable we set up earlier called $policy. -- parameters. And I'll just put our $policy param variable reference in double quotes and I'll press enter. Okay, looks like the assignment has taken place. We can verify our work in the portal. So if I search for Azure Policy in the search field at the top, we're already there, but that's how I would get there. And if I go to assignments, and I might have to click refresh a few times, it'll take a moment. There it is. Allowed virtual machine SKUs. That's been assigned to the HQ resource group within my pay-as-you-go subscription. Back here in the CLI, if I run AZ Policy Assignment List, it'll return all the policy assignments all right, but again, as usual, way too much stuff to look at for what we probably want. What I really want is the display name attribute. So let's just go ahead and up arrow key to bring up that command and add to the end of it -- query space open close square bracket .display name. Name has a capital N. Here it looks like it's only returning subscription level scoped policy assignments. So I'm going to bring up that previous command. And before my -- query, I will add -- disable -scope -strict -match. Enter again. Just make sure I spell everything correctly and enter. There we go. Now we're seeing everything at every scope, including our allowed virtual machine SKUs policy assignment. In this demo, I'm going to be assigning Azure Policy using PowerShell. And I'm going to be using PowerShell through Cloud Shell, of course, although I could be running it on premises. When you think about assigning Azure Policy, you have to think about where you want it assigned in the Azure hierarchy. What's the scope? Will it be a management group so that you are affecting multiple subscriptions? Or do you want to apply your policy or assign it to the subscription so it flows down to everything in that subscription, or perhaps just to one resource group? Here we're going to do it for a resource group called HQ. If I were to minimize Cloud Shell here and in the portal on the left go into my resource groups view, I've got an HQ resource group, so I'll open it up. In the overview page over on the right, if I scroll down, I've got a number of resources deployed here, including a number of virtual machines. Well, what I want to do is I want to check to see which virtual machines have disaster recovery configured. So we want to make sure, of course, for high availability that virtual machines are backed up, perhaps replicated to a secondary region, that type of thing. So let's go back into PowerShell. The first order of business is going to be to get a reference to my resource group. So I'm going to make a variable called $RG. It's going to equal get-az resource group -name HQ. Okay, so we've got that in our variable. If we just echo back, if we just type $RG, okay, we got a pointer to the HQ resource group in that variable. I'm going to make a variable called $policies, which will equal get-az policy definition. I get a little statement that this may change in future versions of the PowerShell modules for Azure. That's fine. If I were to type $policies, it returns all of the policy definition. So it's a collection. It's an array of similar objects, each one being the details about a given policy. So what I can do then is refer to $policies, open square bracket, 0, close square bracket. What that would do is refer to the first policy in the collection or within the array, because they start counting at 0, not 1. If I were to refer to item 1, it's the second item in that collection or that array, so it's a different policy. Well, what I can also do is run $policies and pipe that to the get-member PowerShell command with -type property. We've done this a few times already. What this does is it lets us determine what are the properties related to the policies variable, the policies collection. Well, interestingly, it's got a property called properties, which is where we're going to focus our energy for a moment, because I don't see anything here about display name. But then again, we are referring to a collection of policies, not an individual one, which is why we're going to go down into properties. So if I run $policies, that's my variable, so up arrow key for the previous command, dot properties, and then pipe that to get member, type property. Here we go. We've gone one level further, and now we're getting to what we want. I want the display name of a given policy. That's what I want to refer to. So if I just run $policies dot properties dot display name, see the hierarchy here? We're going deeper and deeper. All it's doing is giving me the display names of the policy definitions. These aren't assignments. These are policy definitions. Okay, so now we're getting somewhere. So now what I'm doing is creating a $definition variable. It will equal get-az policy definition. I want to retrieve a specific policy definition, which I'm going to pipe to where-object, which is a filter. Notice I'm using a space backtick for line continuation to the next line. Now within where object, I have to specify what I'm looking for. What's my filter condition? So within curly braces, I have $_. $_ is a built-in placeholder variable. Think of looping through our collection of all policy definitions, which gets returned when you run get-az policy definition. I want to check each policy. To do that, you need a temporary variable that points to each policy as you loop through them. That's $_. And what I'm doing is checking for it .properties.displayName to see if it equals, with -eq, audit virtual machines without disaster recovery configured. We close the curly brace. So let's clear the screen. Let's just type $definition. Okay, we definitely have that policy definition stored here with its resource ID. So it's in the policy definitions. There's the ID for that policy definition. Perfect. Because we're going to need that ultimately when we want to make a policy assignment, which is what we're going to do now. So how do we do that? How do we make a policy assignment in PowerShell? We do it using new-az policy assignment. That actually makes sense. -name. So I want this to be called policy assignment VMs-dr enabled. -display name can be the same or different. I have it here called check for VM disaster recovery. Could be anything. -scope is going to be my resource group variable $RG, but more specifically the .resource ID property of it. -policy definition that we want to use for this policy assignment. Well, we already did the hard work above. Now we just refer to our $definition variable. Press enter to create this policy assignment in the hierarchy. So we can check our work in a number of ways, including by going back into the portal here and searching for policy and going into the Azure Policy interface, looking at assignments. I'm going to need to click refresh as we've just created that. Here we go. Now it's showing up. Check for VM disaster. Whoops, typo there, but that's okay. Doesn't really matter from a functional standpoint. Check for VM disaster recovery, which is applied to my HQ resource group. In this demonstration, I will be creating and assigning a custom policy. We know what Azure Policy is for. It's for checking compliance, for perhaps imposing restrictions on certain types of VM sizes that can be deployed in certain locations, and so on. Well, what we can do is create a custom policy. You want to make sure that you take the time to familiarize yourself first with the built-in policies that are there, because there might be something you can already use. If not, just like with custom roles for role-based access control, if you have a specific need, with Azure Policy, you can configure a custom policy, which you can then assign to various parts of the Azure hierarchy, otherwise called scopes. Here on my on-premises computer, I've opened up an existing custom Azure policy which uses JSON syntax. This one is designed to only allow Ubuntu Linux to be deployed. Wherever in the Azure hierarchy this policy ends up being assigned. So because it's JSON, of course, we know this now, it's going to start with an open curly brace, and ultimately at the very end, it will end with a closing curly brace. However, the display name here is only Ubuntu. The policy type is set to custom. Now, as we go further down through this custom policy, what I'm doing is checking not. If the image publisher is not canonical, which is used for Linux. Specifically, if we are not using an image offer for Ubuntu server, and then I have the version, then the effect is to deny. It makes perfect sense. Now, mind you, coming up with the syntax is a little bit trickier, and that's why sometimes looking at existing policy definitions and copying them and tweaking them is the best option. Because working in JSON like this is not easy if you don't do it all the time. But when you take a look at this kind of syntax, you should be able to determine what is happening. The AZ-104 exam certainly does not expect us to know how to create all of this from scratch out of thin air. That's not reasonable for the AZ-104 exam. But we certainly have to know when to do these types of things. We should have a way to determine what's happening by looking at it. Back here in the Azure portal, I'm going to search in the search field at the top for the word policy to open up the policy console, where on the left we can go and view policy definitions, as well as initiatives, which are collections of policies. So if I scroll down, eventually I get to individual policies. You can assign individual policies to part of the Azure hierarchy, and as we know, an initiative is a collection or a grouping of related policies to facilitate assignments. But notice at the top, we have a button to add a policy definition, as well to add an initiative definition. We'll talk about initiatives in more detail in another demo. Here we're focusing on custom policy definition. So I'm going to click the Add Policy Definition button at the top. For the definition location, I'm going to make this available in my pay-as-you-go subscription. For the name, I'm going to call it Only Allow Ubuntu Server VMs. I could add the details about the version and sizing regions or whatever else might also be part of the policy. We can also create a category for this policy. We can use an existing category to assign this to, or we can create a new one, which I'm going to do. Category will be called VM Deployment Limitations. So I might have multiple custom policies I create to organize under that category. You don't have to create a new category if you find another one that this would apply to, but that's what I'm doing. Down here we have a sample policy. I'm just going to copy and paste the policy definition we looked at in WordPad a few moments ago so that it appears here. Okay, so this is what we were looking at before, where it's looking for Ubuntu server, and if we are not deploying a VM of that type, then the effect is to deny the request. So when you try to deploy the virtual machine, whether through the portal or command lines or ARM templates, whatever it is, it's going to fail, and you're going to get a reason that it's a policy violation. Okay, let's click Save. Excellent. We now have our Only Allow Ubuntu Server VMs policy. That came from the policy definition, of course, in the display name. So that overrode whatever we would have specified otherwise. We can choose to assign it right here. Let's do it. Let's say I want to do that specifically for a resource group called HQ. So we want to deny any VM deployments to the HQ resource group unless it's Ubuntu server. So I'll select that, review and create. We've now got our custom policy assignment. Let's test it. If we go home and we go to create a resource, let's say a virtual machine, we're not going to choose Ubuntu. Let's violate the policy right away. Let's choose some Windows variant, call it VM test, and I'll specify our HQ resource group, of course. Well, when I go back down to image right away, we've got red text. It says only allow Ubuntu server VMs. It knows right away that you can continue filling everything out and trying to deploy it, but it's just not going to happen. Interesting. But if I choose, for example, Ubuntu server 20.04, it likes it. There is no such red warning message. But if I choose an incorrect version, it depends what's in the policy definition. Here I'm going with Ubuntu server 22.04. Well, my policy definition, my custom policy is looking not at that version. So it still says not allowed. But if I were to switch the resource group, remember that's how our policy assignment was set, let's say to Web App 1, a different resource group, then there are no such restrictions. So if we were to choose Ubuntu 22 or a Windows variant as an OS image, it would let us do it. In this demo, the focus is going to be on working with policy initiatives. With Azure Policy, remember that a policy initiative is a grouping of related policies. We work with policy initiatives because it facilitates policy assignments and overall management. If you've got 6 different policies that you want to apply for a given reason, maybe to secure resources in a resource group for a project, instead of making 6 different policy assignments, you could group those into one policy initiative and then just assign the policy initiative. And you can do that over and over and over. There are a lot of built-in policy initiatives already there in Azure, such as for PCI DSS or FedRAMP security compliance. They consist of many individual policies. So using policy initiatives is a big thing. Whether you build your own, whether you use what's already there. We're going to examine both of those aspects of this topic. Let's get started here in the portal. What are we doing? We are searching for policy so that we can go into the Azure Policy interface. In the left-hand navigator, I'm going to go click on definitions. We've been here a few times already in other demos because there is a definition type column where what we're seeing right now are policy initiatives. But if we just kind of scroll over and then scroll way down through the list, we'll eventually come across individual policies. Now you can filter this because the definition type up at the top here, we could say, I don't want to see all, I just want to see initiatives apply. And then that's all we're going to be looking at are policy initiatives, whether they're built in or whether they're custom. You could also, of course, in the exact same way, filter only for policies. So now I just want to view policies themselves, again, whether they are built-in or custom policies that we can assign to parts of the Azure hierarchy. Now at the top, we can click Add Policy Definition, but we've already done that in another demo, and it is very important to know how to do that. Now we're going to talk about how to add your own custom policy initiative definition. So I'll click the Add Initiative Definition button. Just like with a new policy definition, you can determine where it will be stored, which means it can be used from that part of the Azure hierarchy down. So I might select a resource group. So I might select a management group, which consists of multiple subscriptions, or maybe I only want it available within a subscription. So I'll leave it on my subscription. For the name, I'm going to put in contract 123_compliance. Maybe we have a specific contract where we must comply with certain security standards. It's a contractual obligation. And so we want to make sure that we check resources we deploy in our subscription, storage accounts, virtual machines, web apps, databases, whatever it is. We want to make sure if it's related to contract 123, it's compliant with the required security standards. Now down below, we can assign this to an existing category or create a new one. Let's say use existing, and maybe I'll apply this to the attestation category. You can look at policy definitions and policy initiative definitions based on their category. I'll click Next. Which policies should be added to this policy initiative? I'm going to click Add Policy Definitions, and I would select the appropriate individual policies that would apply to resources for whatever contract 123 requires. Okay, so I've added a couple of policy definitions to this initiative definition. Next. Now, depending on how many policies I add to my initiative, I can suborganize it within the initiative definition by groups. But I've only got, as we know if we go back, 3 policies, so I don't really need to worry about groups. We can also configure parameter values to be used with this initiative, but that doesn't apply here. Based on the policies I've added to this initiative definition, we'll determine if I have any policy parameters that I want to set the value to. So I'll specify the required policy parameters and I'll click Next. And then I'll click Create to create policy initiative definition. And just like that, it's done, contract 123 compliance. So if I were to go back to my policy definitions, search for contract 123, there's contract 123 compliance. It's an initiative. So I could select that and assign from within it. Of course, as we know, in this interface, I can also go to the assignments view on the left. But if I go back to definitions, this is where I'm going to use my policy initiative, and I'll click Assign Initiative. So it's filled in the initiative definition. I'll assign it to my subscription. I'll just choose Review and Create. And it's done. We have successfully configured a custom policy initiative. We know there are plenty of built-in ones. They're just groupings of related policies that we can then use to facilitate assignment throughout the Azure hierarchy. So in this course, we examined how to deploy and manage Azure Policy to ensure configuration and security compliance. We did this by exploring how to assign Azure Policy using the portal, the CLI, and PowerShell. We also went over how to create and assign a custom policy and how to manage policy initiatives. In our next course, we'll move on with exploring how to manage Azure resource locking throughout the Azure hierarchy.